Is cannabis the most used drug outside of alcohol?
Yeah, correct. It's the most used illegal drug, and you're probably right. It's probably the most used drug outside of alcohol. Maybe some prescription medications might come close. Um, but essentially, the most used drug in Australia is caffeine, followed by alcohol, and then as you say, cannabis. And rates of cannabis use remain fairly stable. About 1 in 3 Australians have tried cannabis in their lifetime, and 1 in 10 or slightly more than 1 in 10 have used cannabis in the past 12 months.
And do we know much about that population? Are there things, characteristics about people that are regularly using cannabis that would distinguish them or separate them from people who are not, whether that be socioeconomic status or mental health or other?
Yeah, all of those things predispose an individual to regularly use cannabis. So, yeah, lower socioeconomic status, pre-existing mental health condition, all predispose somebody to end up using cannabis on a regular basis. But there's looking at that population versus the general population, there's not a whole lot of big differences there. We know that regular, heavy, long-term cannabis use does impact cognitive functioning. So, people's functioning on IQ tests will be lower, but it tends to be a temporary thing. And if the person, provided they didn't start at 8 years of age, it tends to be reversible, which is not the case, say, with alcohol. Alcohol causes permanent brain damage. Cannabis, the way I like to describe cannabis and its effects on the brain is it's a bit like putting Jello in the brain. Like, it slows everything down, but once you clean it out, the brain fires up and it's functioning as per normal. I think clinically speaking, one of the most concerning things about people who regularly smoke cannabis is just the amotivation. People become less motivated to get off the couch and do things. And it's not only, I guess, when I was saying that, I was thinking more about, productivity, engaging with society, paying taxes, all of those sorts of things. But it's even more than that. It's things like physical activity. We know sedentary behaviour is it's correlated with nothing good. That's for sure.
Right. So it can have a ripple effect and start to affect other aspects of one's lifestyle, which then affect quality of life, risk of disease, etc. You mentioned heavy use. What would heavy use? How would we define that? What would that be?
Heavy use would be daily use for a start. So using on a daily basis, using multiple times each day, and typically with regular heavy cannabis use, people start to experience problems with sleep. So they without cannabis, they can't sleep, and they may wake up during the night to smoke some cannabis to be able to get back to sleep again.
How does someone kind of break that cycle if they are using cannabis to sort of fight or push back against insomnia and it's working, but they would rather not have to rely on cannabis? What are the steps that someone might go through, or things that you've done with patients that you've worked with clinically?
Yeah, I think there's lots of different options, and so starting at one end of the spectrum, which is the least invasive, I guess, would be to take a harm reduction approach and access cannabis through a medical regulated source, and perhaps changing the route of administration from either going from smoking to vaping, which is far less harmful, or ideally moving to an oral route of administration, because the way cannabis works when it's consumed orally is quite different to the way it's used when it's vaporized or smoked. And consequently, people find that they use far less frequently when they're taking it orally. So I guess that's one end of the spectrum, and the other end of the spectrum would be looking at abstinence. And traditionally, detoxification services in Australia haven't accepted people for cannabis withdrawal if they want to cease completely. So usually it's done by the individual in consultation with a general practitioner and probably a nurse working for an alcohol and other drug treatment service, or an AOD counsellor or psychologist like myself, where the GP prescribes minimal amounts of medication, things like temazepam or Valium, to help take the edge off for that period of withdrawal. Because, as I was sort of saying earlier on, because cannabis is lipophilic and stays in the system for much longer, the withdrawal from cannabis is quite protracted. So with most drugs, withdrawal peaks after 2 or 3 days of ceasing use. Though with cannabis, it doesn't peak till about 10, 12, 14 days after the person stops. So it's far more gradual, but it's far more extended. And that's why detoxification services have typically not taken people for cannabis, because they're set up for a 2-week stay because that's what works for most other drugs. But of course, they're then discharging people with cannabis while they're peaking in terms of the withdrawal. And so most of the time it's being managed in the community, as I've said. During the peak of synthetic cannabis, though, I worked with a number of detoxification services to ensure that they were able to take people in that were wanting to abstain from synthetic cannabis, because it was a completely different drug. Some people have said it shouldn't even be called synthetic cannabis. Essentially, these are synthetic cannabinoid receptor agonists, novel drugs that are being put on some parsley or whatnot, an inert herb to be smoked. And consequently, like the traditional drugs, the withdrawal peaked at about 2 or 3 days. And for some of the newer generation synthetic cannabinoid receptor agonists, the withdrawal was quite severe and could include things like seizures, which is where you really want medical involvement. When we're talking about withdrawal from drugs, the most dangerous drugs to stop taking are alcohol and benzodiazepines, things like Valium and temazepam, because they cause these seizures. And so seeing that in another new drug that was emerging was a real concern at the time, and which was why we really advocated for detoxification services to take on these patients, because they were at an elevated risk of experiencing something going wrong medically if they didn't have that medical supervision.
Hey friends, the scientific evidence on lifestyle habits that lead to longevity is clear. Now it's time to put this knowledge into action. I'm excited to announce the Living Proof Longevity Challenge, a 12-week program to build evidence-based lifestyle habits to optimize longevity. My team and I have transformed over hundreds of hours of conversations with experts on aging, nutrition, and exercise into a life-changing 12-week program that will challenge you to develop habits that lead to a longer, better life. This is a unique opportunity to gather health data about yourself that has the potential to change your life for the better. You'll start by testing 10 longevity biomarkers that tell the truth about where your longevity stands right now, today. Following that, you'll get a personalized longevity score to guide your 12 weeks of habit building that will boost your score and improve your biomarkers for the better. After the challenge, you'll retest your 10 biomarkers and see the proof of how powerful these science-backed habits really are. Head over to theproof.com/livingproof to download your zero-cost copy of the Living Proof Longevity Challenge today. That's theproof.com/livingproof. Look forward to joining you on this journey.
You mentioned that vaping is less harmful. Tell me a little more about that, and I presume that there have been scientific investigations looking at the different risks posed by more traditional smoking versus vaping. When I kind of just think about this, and this is not scientific, just observation of people in society and friends that vape, one thing that kind of worries me is that because it is a little more acceptable and convenient, that perhaps the person ends up actually inhaling a lot more tobacco or a lot more cannabis than they otherwise would have.
Yeah, I would normally try to avoid talking about vaping, but I open up the conversation here, so I'll wear that. The reason I try to avoid it is In my 20 plus years of working in healthcare and public health, I've never seen an issue divide my community the way vaping has. There are, staunch advocates for this being a life-saving intervention for smokers. And then on the other side, there's people concerned about so many young people taking up vaping and it becoming basically the new norm, the new smoking. And what do we do about that? And I see both positions. I think absolutely it can be a life-saving intervention. It's you asked about the research. The British Medical Association has concluded that vaping nicotine is 95% less harmful than smoking tobacco. So that's a significant reduction. But I also really understand the other side's concerns as well. I don't want young people to be dependent on nicotine. I think we've got a huge problem in Australia with black market vapes being distributed to young people in schools. Schools across Australia are trying to deal with the issue. Government's trying to deal with the issue. Unfortunately, I think we've left it too late. It's already in the community now. Australia needed to act 10 years ago, not now. The US and the UK all regulated vaping 10 plus years ago. The Australian TGA wasn't willing to do that because they were concerned about, basically they said, well, there's still 5% harm. 95% less harmful still means 5% harm, and we're not willing to take that risk and be responsible for that. But in doing nothing, that inaction has now led to the current situation where, because there was no regulation in place, a black market emerged, and once the black market is set up, it's very hard to shift that. And I'm not real optimistic about where this is all going. I think we're going to see vaping in the community for a long time to come now.
Yeah, and they're making them to taste so good, right? Which, there's parallels there with the food industry and marketing early in life to kids. And then once they begin to develop those habits, they're very hard to change later on in life.